Today we're going to start a new module, Module 5, and when we last left, we had just created the Constitution. We did away with the Articles of Confederation because it was so weak, and it ultimately failed as our first attempt at government. But now that we have the new United States Constitution, we're really beginning our experiment in Republican government. President Washington launches our new ship of state, and we'll see what happens. So go ahead and get your notes ready to take. And we'll talk about President Washington. He's taking charge of a political system. It's a pretty bold experiment. Never before had our nation tried to base an entire government system on Enlightenment thinking of people like John Locke. Our Constitution is a strong foundation. It is to this day by no means perfect, but what is? But don't think of the Constitution as like a blueprint for governing. It's more like a foundation. Decisions can be made based upon what happens, what is written in the Constitution and how it's interpreted by different people at different times. So every decision that President Washington makes is like setting a precedent. He's really like a pathfinder. He's blazing the trail for future generations of American government leaders, and his administration is important for shaping the future of our government processes. So one of the first things that happens during his administration is the Judiciary Act of 1789. What this does is it answers a lot of questions about how we're going to establish our judicial system, how we're going to have judges and courts, and how our laws are going to be interpreted. So what the Judiciary Act does is it creates a Supreme Court, which consists of a Chief Justice, and at that time, 5 associate justices. Today, the Supreme Court has a Chief Justice and a total of 9 justices. So it also sets up federal circuit courts and federal district courts all throughout the country. So it establishes federal courts. It mentions the supremacy clause in the Constitution, which ensures that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And, it really guarantees that our federal government will be strong and ensure its supremacy over the states. So it's pretty important legislation. Now, President Washington has to shape the executive branch at a time where it was really just him and the vice president, who was John Adams. So he's tasked with building the entire executive branch all from the ground up. So when he took office in 1789, like I said, it was just he and John Adams, the vice president. So he establishes some departments that will help him to execute the laws of the land. So these are executive departments, and these still exist today, along with several others. The 3 that he created, though, were the Department of State. And what the Department of State does is it deals with foreign affairs. The War Department, which today we've renamed the Department of Defense, but at that time it was just called the Department of War or War Department. And they handle matters of the military. Today we have, the Pentagon, which handles a lot of our military establishment. And then we have the Department of Treasury, which is their job is to manage our finances. So in doing this, he has to put some secretaries in charge of these departments. Now, don't think of these secretaries as like people who answer the phone and take messages. These are very powerful people, as they are today. And to head these departments, Washington chose very capable leaders that he knew and trusted. For example, on the right here is Thomas Jefferson. And he was the first Secretary of State who handled the foreign affairs. Alexander Hamilton, here on the left, he was chosen by Washington to be the first Secretary of Treasury. And the middle is Henry Knox, as in like Fort Knox in Kentucky. Henry Knox, he was a general under Washington during the American Revolution, and he was chosen to be the first Secretary of War. Eventually, he adds a guy by the name of Edmund Randolph, who's our first Attorney General. What the Attorney General is like the chief law enforcement officer, like they're the attorney for our nation. Okay, so these department heads soon became the president's main advisors or cabinet. So don't think of like the president's cabinet as what he keeps his dishes in the kitchen. These are the president's advisors. Okay. Now, two of these guys despise each other and can't agree on anything, and that is Hamilton and Jefferson. They're both brilliant guys, geniuses in their own right, but they had different ideas on how people can pursue the American dream. They had very different political ideas, and these differences caused very bitter arguments, much to the President Washington's being upset over it. So these political divisions in our new nation were great, just as our political divisions today are. It's no different. Hamilton, here on the left, he believed in having a strong central government that was going to be led by a wealthy, prosperous, educated, elite upper class of citizenry, whereas Jefferson distrusted having a strong central government, and he favored more strong state and local authority, where political participation was handled at a more of a grassroots or local level. So, Hamilton believed that commerce and industry were going to be our strongest parts of, like manufacturing, whereas Jefferson favored more of an agrarian society, farmer citizens. So, and it goes even farther than this. Hamilton's vision of America was that of a country very much like Great Britain, strong central government, commerce, industry, manufacturing, whereas Thomas Jefferson's view was more favorable to people in the South and people on the frontier of the West, because they tended to be more agricultural in nature. So these two gentlemen and their differences over the way government should operate is going to lead to some pretty lively debate. Okay? Now, Hamilton is the Secretary of Treasury, and so it is his responsibility to get our nation's finances in order and put our nation's economy in strong footing. So to do this, he proposes to manage the country's debts by establishing a strong central national banking system. He wants to create a national bank. So according to his calculations, the United States was several $1 million in debt, whether it be debt to foreign countries like Denmark or France, or debt to even just citizens of the United States who bought bonds during the American Revolution. The United States was several $1 million in debt. So our new nation owed a significant amount of money. We even still owed money to soldiers who the United States gave bonds to for their efforts to fight the war. They have to be paid back plus interest for their services that were rendered. So there's a significant amount of debt. And Hamilton proposed to pay off this debt and issue new bonds to cover the old ones, and even assume the debts that individual states incurred during the American Revolution. All of this increases the federal debt significantly. And he reasoned that assuming the state's debts would give people a reason to want to see the national government of the United States be successful. Because if the government failed, the people who loaned us the money, who loaned the government money, would never get their money back. And so it really incentivizes the citizens to want to see our government be successful and back and support the government. Otherwise, they won't get their money back. So southern states did not like his plan because a lot of the southern states, like the largest state in America, Virginia, had already paid their war debts off because they were a large, prosperous state. So they didn't want to see them have to pay the debts of other states that were going to be incurred into the nation's debt. So a lot of Southerners in southern states resented the assumption of the debts by the national government because it was going to increase their taxes to help pay for the northern states' benefit. All right, so he is going to create the Bank of the United. He wants to create the Bank of the United States, and Hamilton's reasoning for this is that both the federal government and wealthy private investors would fund the bank. So that's kind of a Hamiltonian way of thinking. We want the bank to be created. We want to support merchants and manufacturers and bankers and lawyers. So The purpose of the Bank of the United States is going to be to issue paper money and handle the tax receipts and other government funds. It's going to just be what a bank does. Uh, Obviously, not everybody's has full support of the bank. Most notably, the people that think like Thomas Jefferson. So, Hamilton did have one problem. Nowhere in the United States Constitution does it say that the federal government has the ability to create a bank. It's not in there. And so what he utilizes is this clause in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. It's called the Elastic Clause, which basically says that the country can make laws that are necessary and proper to fulfill the nation's needs. Okay? So he says that, yeah, it's not explicitly written in there, but the government has the ability to stretch to cover the needs of the citizens. And so he has a very loose interpretation of the Constitution, whereas Thomas Jefferson, he wants to limit the power of the government. He says, if it's not in there, you can't do it. So he has a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. So the one that wins out is ultimately Alexander Hamilton, as he's able to convince President Washington and a majority of Congress to accept his views and establish a federal bank of the United States. Okay, now he still has to get support for his debt plan, for assuming all the debt of all the states, particularly from the southern states. At this time, the capital of the United States was New York City, and Alexander Hamilton came to many of these southern delegates, in particularly Thomas Jefferson, and asked them, what if the nation's capital were moved from New York City to a new city in the south, maybe even in the state of Virginia? And this idea pleased a lot of Southerners, particularly people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, who believed a Southern site for the capital would make a government more responsive to their interests. So with this incentive, these Southern states, they agreed to back his debt plan. And in 1790, the debt plan passed, as well as the authorization for a new capital to be built in a place they were going to call the District of Columbia. It wasn't called Washington at first. Washington was the president. They didn't name it after him until after he was gone. But it's going to be located in an area of land, as you can see on this map, in between the states of Virginia and Maryland. And it's its own district, all its own. Okay? Some people that were going to be very influential in drawing up the plans for the new capital were Pierre L'Enfant. He's a French engineer. Andrew Ellicott, he actually ends up replacing L'Enfant, but kept a grand vision of what our capital is going to be. Even a significant amount of the surveying done of this swampy area of in between Virginia and Maryland, that is now Washington, D.C., was done by Benjamin Banneker, who was African American, which was kind of crazy at that time to have such an important job given in our national government to a person of color. So that's a wonderful thing. The majority of the actual buildings in Washington were built by slaves, as both Virginia and Maryland were slave states. But with the assistance of Benjamin Banneker, the plan for the capital of the United States was going to be, having grand boulevards and traffic circles and monuments that were reminiscent of many large European cities. And by 1800, by the end of John Adams' presidency, the capital had moved from New York to this new site along the Potomac River in between Virginia and Maryland called Washington, D.C. All right. Now, you have to imagine, in our Constitution, nowhere does it say that political parties exist. Political parties don't emerge until Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson start having to have such deep rifts and deep disagreements between themselves and arguments. So the two men clashed continually over government policy, and this conflict in President Washington's cabinet divided and fueled a growing division in our nation's politics. So this split helped to give rise to America's very first ever political parties. President Washington is the only president to not be associated with a political party. They didn't exist when he was elected. the two parties formed around some key issues in American history. Mainly the main one was what was going to be the size and influence of the federal government. Remember, Hamilton wants a large, powerful federal government. Jefferson, fearful of a strong, powerful federal government. So those who shared Hamilton's vision of a strong central government are called Federalists. And those who support Jefferson's vision of strong state governments called themselves Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonians. They had a lot of different names, okay? So the very existence of political parties worried a lot of leaders, including George Washington, and he really saw in his farewell address to the nation that political parties were a danger to our national unity, as the two-party system would create a large rift in our nation, and to some extent, he's right. Okay, so but needless to say, the two-party system was created out of our nation's first presidency, and it still exists today, where only two political parties really have a realistic chance of winning: the Democrats and the Republicans. Later on in Washington's presidency, during his second term, an incident occurs that reflected the tensions between the federal and regional interests. So one of the things that happens early in Washington's presidency in 1789, Congress passed a protective tariff, which is an import tax on goods produced in Europe. This means this tax was meant to encourage American production. So if it's meant to encourage American production, which region of our nation is that most likely to help? Well, there's not a lot of manufacturing in the South. It's mostly agricultural, so it's more likely to benefit citizens in the northern states. So even though it was intended to increase American production, and it did bring in a great deal of revenue, Secretary Hamilton still needed more to pay off that large debt he incurred. So he convinced Washington to push through an extra tax called an excise tax, which is the tax on a particular good. And the good in which he wanted to see taxed was going to be whiskey. Now, most whiskey producers were from small frontier farmers because their main crop was corn. And in places like where we live, in West Virginia, and Western Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, corn was very difficult to transport across the Appalachian Mountains and sell in settled areas along the Atlantic. Therefore, farmers that had a surplus of corn would distill it into whiskey, and it could be more easily sent to market on the back of pack animals. So whiskey was really used as a single source of cash for a lot of these frontier farmers, and Hamilton knew that this excise tax would make them furious, and it did. So these frontier farmers felt like they were being mistreated because they had to pay this additional tax on this only good that they had that they could make some income on. So in 1794, some farmers in western Pennsylvania simply refused to pay it. They said, "We are not paying this excise tax." They beat up federal marshals in the city of Pittsburgh and even threatened to secede from the Union, creating a nation all their own. So once again, you see citizens using violence and force against the government to get their way. Well, this cannot be allowed. If you remember what happened in Shays' Rebellion, where people rebelled against the government, and for a while, anarchy ruled. Well, Washington and Hamilton looked upon this whiskey rebellion as an opportunity for the federal government to flex its muscles and show how strong it was. So, George Washington calls up 15,000 militiamen and accompanies them all the way to western Pennsylvania, hiking across the Alleghenies, and really tries to, when they get there, they don't find like a rabble army camped out, because it's just citizens that don't want to pay their taxes. Everybody's just at home. So it's not like there's a big, rabble roaming the countryside, tarring and feathering people on the regular. They did tar and feather people, but it was, just a couple of times. So it was almost like, Jefferson and his Jeffersonian Republicans condemned Washington's and Hamilton's action as being, like a tyranny, using the military to put the people down, whereas Hamilton and Washington viewed it as a milestone that the federal government has the ability to control the affairs of the American people to keep people safe. So, Whiskey Rebellion, pretty important event in America's history, and it shows how powerful the federal government had the ability to be. So this is, went through it pretty quick. Make sure that you read. This is Module 5, Lesson 1. Take a look at it, read it, do your journal entry today, take notes on this assignment, and we'll do an activity tomorrow on Lesson 1. And then notes the next day, and then an activity, just like always. So nothing's really changed for us. If you have questions, I'm always available to you, day or night, within a reasonable amount of time. And if you need to talk to me in person, I'll be glad to do a one-on-one Teams meeting with you. Just send me an email, a message through Schoology, whatever you need. I'm here to serve. So I hope you guys are taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will talk to you later. Have a good day.